Most research would tend to find that the BBC, it's basically orientated towards the establishment, towards the political elites in Westminster. The way it does political reporting is like what I would call kind of embedded role of reporting. It's not antagonistic or oppositional. They see their role, Nick Robinson or Laura Kuenssberg, as basically being close to the political elite, and I don't mean like literally like not being buddies with them necessarily, but like trying to get an understanding of where they are, what they're doing and what they're thinking and so on. And the effect of this essentially is that, and this happens in all journalism, you develop these sort of symbiotic relationships where you have an interest as a journalist on reporting what's going on in politics, but also you very quickly become like an insider in that kind of world, and Nick Robinson, to his credit, was pretty candid about that. He's described himself as like, a cog in the Westminster machine and so on. I think that's a pretty accurate description of what they do. They're interested in the sort of ups and downs and the ins and outs and some of the mechanisms. They don't have a basically sort of critical analysis of what's going on or why it's going on. So I think that's a big problem with their political reporting. There's a sort of sense of day in, day out that you don't really get a sense of what's at stake. And I think that's, one of the reasons people just switch off to the BBC's reporting. Now, in terms of like questions of bias, I think it's very clear. There's not been very good research on this. Justin Schurisberg did some research on the BBC's treatment of Corbynism at the time of the so-called coup against Jeremy Corbyn. They found that the BBC was giving more airtime to Corbyn's critics compared to ITV, and that's the only research that I'm aware of that looks at Corbyn and Corbynism. Underlying really, and this isn't really about the BBC, I think it's about like British political culture. I just think underlying all reporting is this sort of sense that of who the legitimate players are, and they tend to be these conservative politicians. So it doesn't mean that they necessarily like them, but there's a sort of sense of legitimacy of these institutions and these people. And I think sometimes it's just like sort of gobsmacking, like, seeing it and the way that they report official statements. But it's a problem with all journalism, that you develop these kinds of relationships with political elites, with, the spokespeople, with the PR people, and you can get ahead by fostering those kinds of relationships. So yeah, what the media should be doing is trying to take a step back for that and explaining to people what's going on and allowing them to have the information and access to make informed decisions about what's happening. As I said, that we're going to be approaching another crisis point where we as citizens will have an opportunity to exercise our democratic vote again. Now, I suppose the other question is like, why isn't the media able to do that anyway? And that I think brings up a whole host of questions around the structure again of these kinds of institutions. Why does the press lie to people about the EU? Why does the BBC not seem to be informing people about key elements of politics and our democracy? I think we can look at these institutions, and I think people rarely do it in a critical, or even sort of empirical kind of way. But I think it's very clear that there are reasons for this, and they could be addressed if we had different sorts of institutions. The conservative media, the way to look at the conservative media, I think, is like you have the tabloids essentially are trying to maintain a mass market and try and maintain interest whilst also reflecting the commercial interests of the owners. So that's why you get racism. That's why you get these sort of fragrant kind of lies coming from these kind of institutions, because they're trying to sort of build something like a coherent ideology that ties together a sort of a popular mass market with the interests of like tax avoiding oligarchs. Now, in the case of the BBC, they're basically trying to implement their responsibility to impartiality in a context of a highly politicized institution. So the BBC has never been independent of the state, as I mentioned earlier. It's essentially a quasi-state broadcaster. They're very vulnerable to political pressure. They tend to be focused on the most senior people in Westminster. They tend to be relatively deferential to their perspectives, and that means that on key issues, they're simply either going to be misinforming their audience or not asking the appropriate questions or critical questions that they should be at key junctures. And I think we're seeing a lot of that quite explicitly now, which is why I think like there is a lot more anger at the BBC. I was actually earlier today looking at Ofcom's report on impartiality, and people's ratings of impartiality for the BBC are much lower than the other broadcasters. I mean, it doesn't really get commented on, but they're slightly higher than Channel 5, which no one takes seriously as a news source. Channel 5 news is just kind of a joke in the industry. But Sky News, ITV, Channel 4, they're all more highly rated than the BBC on impartiality. Now, I think there might be good reasons for that don't actually relate to the BBC's role. I mean, partly because more people watch the BBC, which means that its audience is going to be maybe less dedicated because it's sort of a more normal thing to do. But the fact is that the stats show that the BBC isn't particularly highly rated on impartiality. I think some of it's not quite some of the discontent hasn't quite fed through into polls yet. But I think the BBC is in a pretty dangerous time right now. We need to save the BBC from itself, really. And that, I think, will mean fundamentally transforming it as an organisation, starting with the BBC as it is, not as we would like it to be. We can take the BBC as we like it to be, and we could try and get there. But I think people need to stop imagining the BBC as being, what they would want it to be. If that's the kind of BBC we want, then we're going to have to work to get it, because it's not the BBC we've got at the moment, I don't think. I think all elections should be focused on the policy options and the sort of country that we want to have, right? And if you look at research on, there's loads of heaps and heaps of research on how elections get reported. I mean, basically, it tends to focus on what they call like horse race reporting. So, how's everyone polling? Who's going to vote here? And so-and-so's at 40%. And what do people think about so-and-so's speech? This is all completely insubstantial, and the personalities of the politicians are sort of, it's not that they're not important, but like in the grand scheme of things, they're not really going to matter. The responsibility of the media should be to focus on policy. Now, I think what's quite important actually is that usually this gives a disadvantage to the right, and you notice that they tend to not do that, and that plays quite well actually for a whole host of interests, but particularly, I mean, say conservative policies tend to not be so popular. Some of them are, so like policies on immigration, for example, and that's why the right tends to hammer away at that stuff, because they've managed to sort of build up a sort of a certain amount of public support for that kind of agenda. Now, the other thing that happens is that this is a very subtle form of bias actually. On the BBC, it tends to be the issues that benefit the right that come to the fore in election campaigns. So the media should be thinking about, number one, this is debate over policy. It's a debate over the future country that we want. We're going to inform people about that. We're going to give them an informed choice about that they're going to make. But also, we're going to try and be careful about the prominence that we give to particular policy issues, because this can create a very subtle form of imbalance. What different sides in an election do is they try and get obviously the policies that they want to be debated to the forefront. And there was a good piece of research that looked at the 2015 election, and it found that this gave the Ed Miliband's Labour Party a real disadvantage, because the issues that they were strong on just weren't being discussed. And you'll remember there was all this debate around who's going to form a coalition with who and so on. And again, it was you have an election where there's no discussion of policy. It's kind of extraordinary. But actually, this is how Thatcher won elections. She would go into an election, they wouldn't say, oh, we're going to privatise everything, or we're going to smash the unions. They'd just have a few slogans, and they'd attack their opponents. And then that's much more, that kind of negative politics is much more advanced in the States. And I think in what's coming, we're going to see a lot of that, that American style, like oppositional research, where you'll have people coming in and digging up dirt, and they'll be trying out like attack lines. A responsible media shouldn't have any involvement in any of that. They shouldn't be amplifying misinformation, and they shouldn't be amplifying smears. They should be trying to hold an informed debate about what are the policy options available to people, and trying to help them make decisions in their interests.